Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the what is known as the enabling legislation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Shadow Minister's second reading amendment. And previous speakers have spoken about why Labor has agreed to support this bill. I'm not going to go to that. I'm going to go to my deep concerns about elements that are within the free trade agreement and why it's so important that Labor has committed to fix those things when we're in government. Because this agreement, yet again, demonstrates that this government is intent on giving away the sovereignty of this nation. It is intent on trading away things that matter to the vast majority of Australian people for gains for certain sectors. Gains for certain sectors, Mr Deputy Speaker. If I can first go to investor-state dispute settlement clauses, this agreement extends the right of to Canadian companies to sue the Australian government if the Australian government makes policy decisions that impact on their profitability, a right that Australian corporations do not have. The extension of ISDS must be opposed, Mr Deputy Speaker. It restricts the sovereignty, it restricts the ability of this place and the Senate to legislate for the welfare of all Australians. And we only have to see what happened when Philip Morris challenged the great Labor's plain packaging tobacco laws through the Hong Kong Free Trade Agreement. ISDS is a cancer. It's a cancer that attacks the sovereignty of democratic governments. It's a cancer that other governments around the world are standing up to. I welcome and applaud the move by the Labor Jacinda Ardern government in New Zealand to work to remove ISDS clauses in free trade agreements. I welcome the EU's very strong stance on it and the fact that the EU has ruled that any trade agreement that has ISDS has to go through ratification of all EU parliaments, home parliaments, because it is such a significant attack on the sovereignty of those parliaments. So I am again deeply concerned that this government seems intent on giving away ISDS and empowering foreign corporations to have power over this parliament, because that's what ISDS does, Mr Deputy Speaker. My other grave concern around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is around labour market testing, the labour mobility clauses that really diminish the ability of this parliament to regulate immigration policy. And this is another trade agreement where this government is trading away immigration policy to, in return for gains for particular sectors. Now, I'm hearing interjections from the honourable member for Kennedy. He would be slightly more credible if he doesn't continue to offer confidence to the government that gives away those rights. If the member for Kennedy was really serious about getting more progressive and progressive trade policy, he might think about why he continues to back this government, Mr Deputy Speaker. And that demonstrates the inconsistency of the member for Kennedy on this matter. Only the impotent are pure, Mr Deputy Speaker. Only the impotent are pure.
Sorry, the member for Shortland.
He has said that I continue to support this government with these policies. It was this government that introduced all the free trade policies.
Order. I thank the honourable member for Kennedy, but the member for Shortland has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I talked about the member for Kennedy continuing to offer confidence to a government that has sold out this nation by including labour market testing exemptions in this trade agreement. And that's a matter of fact, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's a fact. Now, this is incredibly worrying that we see an exemption from labour market testing being rolled out to 6 countries: Canada, Peru, Mexico, Brunei, Malaysia and Vietnam. This diminishes our ability to regulate temporary skilled migration in this country, and that's very worrying. It is driving massive job insecurity, Mr Deputy Speaker. We have over 1 million people in this country who have work rights on temporary visas. Now, I support permanent migration. Permanent migration has made this nation. I'm a proud child of migrants, but they should be permanent migrants with all the rights that native-born Australians have. They should have all the rights: the right to strike, the right to unionise, the right to get the same pay, and those rights aren't afforded those on temporary skilled visas. Those workers have no rights because they have no bargaining power. At a flick of the thumb, an employer can basically sack them and they get deported overseas. And that's why it's so important that before we allow temporary skilled visas to be issued, that the employer does three things. First, that they demonstrate that the position cannot be filled by an Australian at the market rate of pay, not the minimum rate of pay, the market rate of pay. Secondly, that they will pay the migrant, the visa holder, the market rate of pay, not the minimum pay. And thirdly, that they will actually invest in training so that an Australian can fill that job in the long term. And this agreement undermines that by exempting labour market testing for visa applicants from those 6 countries. As worryingly is around skills recognition. This agreement means that a Peruvian electrician's qualifications must be accepted as being the equivalent of an Australian electrician, or a Chilean electrician, or a Mexican electrician, or a Canadian electrician. And that is abhorrent, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we don't have skills testing, because that goes to a safety issue. That's a safety issue that both the industry group for the electrical industry and the trade union representing the electrical industry, the ETU, have drawn a huge concern over. This, yet again, is this government giving away our immigration policy, a party that is supposedly so strong on border protection, giving away our immigration policy for gains for certain sectors, particularly their supporters in the agricultural and resources industry, giving away our immigration policy to reward their mates in mining and agriculture. And I think that's deeply problematic, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that's why it's so important that Labor has given a commitment to end this. That we'll do 2 things, Mr Deputy Speaker. If we're privileged enough to win government, if we're lucky enough to win government, Minister for Trade will, the new Minister for Trade, the member for Blaxland, will immediately start to renegotiate this agreement. He will negotiate side letters with the 6 nations that have this labour market testing exemption to get that removed, so that we can continue to apply labour market testing to temporary skilled migrants coming from those 6 countries. And he'll also negotiate with Canada to remove the ISDS clause. And this can be done by side letters. And I'm very encouraged that the Minister for Trade in a future Labor government, if we're privileged enough to be elected, will work on that very quickly and directly. So that's an important step to fixing up this Trans-Pacific Partnership, something this government won't do, something this government cares nothing about. The second measure, which I am even more enthused about, is that a future Labor government will implement the most progressive trade policy this nation has seen in the last 40 years. A future Labor government will implement the most progressive trade policy in the next 40 years by undertaking a number of measures, and they include a legislated prohibition on future trade agreements containing waivers of labour market testing, prohibiting future governments from negotiating trade agreements that waive mandatory skills testing, and prohibiting future governments from including ISDS clauses in trade agreements. That is incredibly important. That is incredibly important, and I'm hearing gibbering from the cheap seats over there, because the truth is independents can't deliver this. The member for Kennedy can't deliver this. The member for Kennedy's been in this place since, what, 1990 or 1993, and I honour his long service to the nation, but he hasn't changed the trade debate one iota, because he can't form government. He can't form government. He had a 3-year window in a minority government where he could have done something, but yet again he didn't do something about it. So that's why I'm so proud that a future Labor government will end this.
Just a moment, please. Member for Kennedy on a point of order.
I claim to be misrepresented. He said I've made no changes.
There's no capacity for you to— you can do a personal explanation later on, Member for Kennedy. You no longer have the call. I give the call to the member for Shortland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I seem to have hit a sensitive spot with the member for Kennedy. The truth is that a future Labor government will ban the sort of negative parts of this Trans-Pacific Partnership and what we saw in the China Free Trade Agreement. A future Labor government will prohibit any trade agreement from containing waivers of labour market testing, waivers of mandatory skills testing and inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement clauses. And that's a very important improvement, and I welcome the Shadow Trade Minister's initiative there. The Shadow Trade Minister's also indicated that a future Labor government will implement other reforms that I think will improve the trade debate in this country. He will legislate, if he is lucky enough to be elected, to establish a system of accredited trade advisors from industry unions and civil society groups which will provide real-time feedback on draft trade agreement text during negotiations. It's true, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have the most opaque trade negotiations of any advanced nation. If you look at the system in the US, where you've got regular briefings of Congress during the negotiations, where you've got accredited trade advisors, a panel that is briefed about trade negotiations, provides feedback on trade negotiations as they progress, and that doesn't undermine their negotiating position. It informs their negotiating position and improves the outcome for those nations. A future Labor government will also legislate to require an independent national interest assessment to be conducted on every new trade agreement before it's signed, to examine the economic, strategic and social impact of any new trade agreement. And if we're privileged enough to be elected, a future Labor government will also strengthen the role of Parliament in trade negotiations by increasing the participation of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties, by providing JSCOT with a statement of objectives for negotiation for consideration and feedback, and providing JSCOT with a briefing at the end of each round of negotiations. And again, these are important reforms that will improve trade policy in this nation. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I remain very concerned about aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, aspects that go to the sovereignty of this nation, aspects that go to whether we can provide secure, well-paying jobs for all Australians. And I am relieved that a future Labor government will fix those issues in both this trade agreement but all other trade agreements, Madam Deputy Speaker. And that's really important. And I just want to finish by just contemplating again the impact of attempts by people to move cheap amendments that actually don't do anything, because those amendments can't actually be done to a trade agreement that's negotiated between 11 countries. The hard decision here was really about whether to support a trade agreement or not, whether to support it and try and fix it or to vote it down, and that was a very hard debate that was held both within the Labor Party room and is witnessed here today in the chamber. But I'm confident that a future Labor government will pursue a progressive trade policy that will improve the results for Australia from these trade agreements, that will protect fundamental worker rights, that will maintain the sovereignty of this parliament and future parliaments, and that's incredibly important. And you can be pro-trade liberalisation without agreeing to every trade agreement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that's why I'm so heartened by the Shadow Minister's commitments around future legislative reforms in this area.
Thank you.